Afternoon, Council, staff, ladies and gentlemen online. We're meeting this afternoon in a special meeting of Council, which is actually a continuation of the last meeting at which we began to consider our, well, it's a separate meeting, but it's a continuation of the discussion regarding our budget. And we found it necessary to schedule this meeting in order to complete our deliberations on budget matters. So I'll call the meeting to order, and we'll begin with roll call, please.
I'm here if you can hear me.
We can hear you. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you.
So all councillors are present, either in person or Councillor Harding, who is here via the internet. And Councillor Meisner has indicated that she must be excused, or would request that we excuse her from this meeting by virtue of a work conflict. So I'm looking for a motion to excuse Councillor Meisner, moved by Councillor Allen, seconded by Dick. Any discussion? No discussion. All those in favor, please vote now.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor. That's unanimous. Thank you. If the Deputy Mayor is voting in favor, and she is. You all have the agenda before you, which is, of course, brief in its in the agenda length. That doesn't necessarily indicate how brief the meeting will be. So I'm looking for a motion to approve the agenda as circulated. Thank you, Councillor June. Councillor Windsor. Any discussion, errors or omissions? If not, please vote yea or nay now.
Yay for me.
Thank you, Councillor. And that motion is passed unanimously. Council is familiar with this process, but perhaps those online are not. This is the point at which we look to all of the councillors at the table to determine whether they feel they have a conflict with any item that is now on the approved agenda. It's unlikely, but I look for your indication in any event. And there are no conflicts of interest. So we're moving to item 4, financial services, and Mr. Barr is here to present along with Mr. Livingston. And I'll turn the meeting over to you, Mr. Barr. Just get your light on for you here. There you go.
Great, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon, Council. And start off by thanking Council as well for the deliberations last week. They're certainly meaningful, and we really appreciate the direction and feedback that was provided last week that kind of leads to this updated request for decision for Council. Technology issue right off the bat.
For the consumption of the public, watching the dead air is associated with technology issues. We're ready?
We got it. We're ready. So following the deliberations last week, staff have gone back and reviewed our recommendations, and the request for decision that's in front of you today really focuses in on two major areas of revisions that we're proposing to result in the revised 6 remaining recommendations related to the budget for 23-24. The first area of major revisions involves debt utilization. That was certainly some of the feedback that we received from the first deliberations. So you'll notice I'm going to give like an overview of some of this stuff, and then Mike will be coming up to provide more details. But you'll notice that certainly debt utilization over the 5-year forecasts that we've outlined in the budget book this year has been significantly reduced. And then secondly was around the operating reserve balances. And so we've received some additional information and have revised some numbers to present what is essentially a larger budgeted ending balance for the operating reserve. So I'll talk about kind of high level about both the debt and reserve before Mike gets into the details, but just kind of some background information. So as it relates to long-term debt, some thresholds that we always consider when we're developing our recommendations are that under the municipality's financial policy FIN 05004 comprehensive debt, it outlines that it would not exceed 10% of our own source revenues, and it states very explicitly that it shall not exceed 12%. This is comparative to the provincial financial condition indicator, the FCIs, that states that anything that's maintained under 10% is considered low risk, 10 to 15 is moderate risk, and anything above 15 is considered high risk. So to that end, from the long-term debt side of it, and as we kind of deliberated about what recommendations to bring, we certainly had in our mind finding that balance against what had been previously approved strategic projects by council and trying to find a good path forward to kind of achieve the outcome that we were looking to do. Kind of in summary, what we're presenting to you today is reducing the debt in this upcoming fiscal year by over $1 million and looking to reduce it from 9.5 down to approximately 8.5 million for 23-24. More dramatically though is over the next 5 years, reducing that debt for the municipality by about $14.5 million, going from about 33.5 million down to just under 19 million. So a dramatic difference over the 5 years. So you'll recall, looking at the original document, we outlined a projected, I guess, from a worst case scenario perspective, the debt service obligation of about 9.2%. So still under the 10% low risk, but certainly approaching that number much more than is currently and what we've proposed here in the revised recommendation. So what we're going to be putting in front of you today and what Michael outlined shows that our debt service obligation has been reduced down to 4.9%. So importantly, and it's outlined in the request for decision, when you look at the debt service ratio that's outlined, it's about 6%, but when you consider the impact of excluding the partner shares of regional sewer, something Councillor Armstrong was asked a lot about, we thought it would better reflect exactly what that debt service obligation is with those offsetting revenues. So that number excludes Greenwood Water Utility, which the 9.2% did as well, because of its own self-contained set of financial statements and everything associated with the utility. The 4.9, like I mentioned, the 6.0 doesn't exclude it, but the 4.9 does exclude the partner shares of the regional sewer to kind of give a good representation of what's there for the municipality. And it includes project spending from 22-23 and any existing debt service obligations. So in the RFD, you'll see a table that outlines all of those broken out by different rate groups and also by existing debt obligations, so that you can dive into the details a little bit more with it. As mentioned before, the low risk FCI is 10%, and by policy of the municipality, it should be 10%, shall be less than 12. So looking at this kind of on a graphical basis, and it's a little hard to see up on the screen, but there's really 3 lines that are up there. The top one is the red line, that's the provincial limit, and also a policy limit around 10%. So going straight across in red. The yellow kind of gold color line is what was originally proposed. So you can see where it increases dramatically in the first couple of years and then maintains a little higher than 9%. And then what you can see is what we're presenting to you today as a revised debt service number of just under 5%. Moving on just at an overview level before, again, Mike Livingston goes into the details from a reserves perspective. Similarly, we have to look at threshold considerations, and those are outlined in our financial policies under FIN 05017, reserve policy. And so as a percentage of our own source revenue plus debt service, looking at that being greater than 10% by our policy. Under the provincial FCI does a little bit different calculation where it looks at our reserves as a percentage of operating expenditures. And what we're noting there is that anything greater than 20% is considered low risk by the province, greater than 10% and less than 20 being moderate risk, and anything less than 10% being high risk. So to this end, we've got 4 key adjustments that are going to be outlined by Mr. Livingston, and that kind of have impacted the reserve balance. And what we're proposing is seeing that increase by a little more than $1.6 million from about 10.3 up to closer to 12 million. So that operating reserve balance we're now projecting to be 28.5%. So a few comments about that is that it's down from the high of a couple years ago, which would have been at 40.4%. And there's a few major reasons associated with that. One is, you'll recall, the creation of the COVID-19 reserve. So that was maintained within our operating reserve balances. So that's from alternative expenditures and diversion of capital reserves. So over the last couple of years, we obviously have utilized that. And in the proposed budget, we're proposing closing that and transferring the balance to capital reserves. So that's had a big impact on the number as well. Another reason is in relation to the Hansport Fire Station funding. So as you recall from previous presentations to council and last year's budget, it was budgeted that the payment and the release of those funds to support the Hansport Fire Station would come out of the operating reserve. So that's has been accounted for in the projected 28.5, and that obviously is repaid by the ratepayers, the area ratepayers for Hansport associated with that. And then a third one that's not as easy to kind of identify is when you look at the ratio and the denominator of that ratio, it has to do with operating expenditures. And there's obviously been a significant increase over the last few years in our operating expenditure budgets. So the graph I'm going to show you on the next page shows you the levels of the operating reserve balance, but as a percentage of operating expenses, that percentage is obviously going down a little bit because of the growth in the operating expenditures. A couple things just to mention before I take you over to the slide is the operating reserve balance of 28.5. From a worst case, and this is a consideration every year, a worst case scenario, we could see this drop as low as just under 25%. And that has to do with both our policy related to surplus allocation and some anticipated expenditures related to RCMP retro costs. So in the last week, we've learned a little bit more around that at the federal level, that the municipalities may be required to pay their share of the retro costs associated with the collective bargaining agreement with the RCMP dating back to 2016. So we have an estimate associated with that, and if need be, we'll be setting up an accrual for that at year end, and that could have an impact on this. And then obviously our surplus allocation policy, which is policy FIN 05014, prioritizes the use of any surplus from the current fiscal year to be put towards current or future long-term debt, so that it can reduce the debt burden. So there is a potential if that full surplus is fully utilized that this could drop down as low as 25%, but that again is a consideration every year with some post-year-end type things that have to happen. But save for that, this graph kind of represents the changes that we're recommending around the operating reserve balances. So the columns in green are the historical, so dating back to 2017, 2018. So we're at about $8.5 million in our operating reserve balance. And then as we head into the COVID years of 2021, you can see the growth in that reserve balance related predominantly to that and other factors, obviously. And then in the graph showing all the historical, we've got the last green one, which is 22-23, where we're showing a forecasted ending balance. And then the last two colors, the gold yellow one is what was originally proposed in the operating budget in terms of our ending reserve balance, and the blue one is what we're bringing to you today in terms of a proposed revision and how we would end. So you can see that it's up closer to $12 million, and when you normalize some of the other items, is not a significant reduction from where it has been. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to walk you through the details of the debt project sheets revisions and also the operating reserve revisions. And then I'll come back up when we get ready to get into the recommendations to field any additional questions you might have.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Livingston.
Thank you. So on the slide now, you see the listing of project revisions and the reference to Appendix A, which contains copies of any of the revised project sheets that factor into the changes we're presenting today. So those 5 projects are the rain gauges and wind monitoring, the Meadowview solar garden, pedestrian infrastructure, municipal accessibility upgrades, and active transportation infrastructure. Also in Appendix C, there's a reconciliation of the 5-year capital plan from what was originally proposed and presented to what is being presented today. So the first of the 5 projects is the rain gauges and wind monitoring. And this project has been adjusted in accordance with the briefing that was brought forward on March 29th, 2023. So basically what was presented then was a deferral of the budgeted activity for 23-24 into the 24-25 and 25-26 years. And in its place in 23-24, we are adding $30,000 for feasibility work related to the project activity to take place in the following years. Overall, that change resulted in a reduction in the 23-24 project budget of $520,000, and that is completely associated with the long-term debt that was contemplated for that project. So the key principle here is that the feasibility work will inform the approach going forward, and with that behind us come next year's budget considerations and deliberations. We'll have that information at hand to inform the decision making at that time. The next project was the Meadowview Solar Garden. Basically, this project sheet has been completely emptied out of the cost items and the financing plan. And that logic is associated with the IMSA delivery model that is more likely than not going to be the method of delivery for that project. And a key component of that project going forward as an IMSA is that it would be, or at least the feasibility model that informs that project is such that that project will be self-sustaining, meaning its annual operating costs, including its annual debt service obligations, would be equally or more so offset by power sales and the revenue generated as a result. So, as is the case with our existing IMSAs, for example, King's Transit and Valley Waste, the debt that is held by those individual organizations doesn't form part of the debt service obligation calculation that takes place at the municipal level. So that is sort of the key element as to how that's been removed from the debt service calculation currently. But just once again wanted to highlight the self-sufficiency contained within that project's financing model. The project sheet for that, which was 23-3405, is maintained, although as I mentioned, it doesn't have any cost figures. That detail has been moved out of the financial detail section and up into the project description and funding source detail. It works through the total project costs as per the feasibility study that was undertaken. As well, it discusses some of the third-party financing targets to enable the feasibility. And of course, just wanted to once again highlight, as is detailed on the project sheet itself, that project, when it becomes closer to moving forward, will return to council for discussion and final approval. The next project modification was in the pedestrian infrastructure project. This one saw a significant reduction in budget for the 24-25 year of $4.6 million, and that is specifically related to sidewalk leading to Horton High School. And the reason why this project was removed is due to some complexity identified associated with the project, in particular how it would interact with Highway 101. And then on top of that, there's some significant questions in terms of how the project should ultimately be financed and how those costs would be covered. So taken out the scope of work contemplated for 24-25, left in what was previously designed budget in 23-24, and instead that will make up feasibility work as well as maybe perhaps some preliminary design that will then be used to inform bringing that project forward again in a future budget year for consideration. The next slide I have for you here is related to two of the projects, the accessibility and the active transportation projects, and these have been modified in a very similar way, which is why I've combined them into a single slide. So as I mentioned, both projects received similar revisions. The financing has been changed from long-term debt to funding from operations in the 24-25 fiscal period and forward in the 5-year capital plan. The intention there is that in any given fiscal period, those funds would be available for project spending for either accessibility or active transportation. But if in a given period there wasn't full utilization or perhaps any utilization of those funds, they could be directed into a dedicated operating reserve or capital reserve, depending on how it gets made up, but into a dedicated reserve for specifically accessibility and AT projects, so that in a future period, if there's perhaps more scope of work or a higher cost initiative, then those funds can be carried forward and utilized to offset the increased cost. Looking at the 23-24 fiscal period, there's been no change to the budget amounts in those years. The active transportation project has specific projects that budget is tied to. However, the accessibility project currently is still more of a placeholder and continues to contemplate utilization of long-term debt. The intention here is that it would be there and available to respond to any pressing accessibility needs that may be identified during the 23-24 period. So that was all for the debt. There'll be a high-level summary of the impacts on both the operating and capital budget on a later slide, but now we can move straight into the changes that are impacting the operating reserve.
If you could just hold for a second. I look to council. If you have questions when these pauses take place, it would be appropriate to bring them forward. At this time, I think, Councillor Windsor, do you have a question of clarification?
Yes. Yes, I wasn't sure if when the questions were going to be woven in, but I appreciate the opportunity. Just a general question to Mike or to Greg. When we take something out for the 24-25 fiscal capital plan year, how does that impact the debt for the current year? We were just talking about the pedestrian as an example.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Mayor. The impact in the 23-24 budget in particular is basically nothing. It really only impacts that 5-year look. And within the RFDs, you can see the reconciliation, and that really just takes a look at, okay, what would be the maximum impact that would be felt within that 5-year period? It's not looking specifically at 23-24. 23-24, the debt service obligation is right around the 1.8% mark.
Okay, so when we talk about a future year, we're not talking about an impact on the debt for the budget year of 23-24.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor. I do have some questions scattered through the document that I reviewed that was distributed, but maybe it's best to allow things to carry on. They may be answered, the questions may.
Thank you, Councillor. I think that's appropriate. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to staff, there's a couple of places in this document that was attached, is part of our agenda package. And there's at least 2 places where it says the Greenwood water utility is excluded from these calculations. And I believe I heard Greg say that that was the case in the previous presentation. Is that, I'm just wondering why it wasn't said in the previous presentation.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a terrific answer through you, Mr. Mayor, as to why that wasn't explicitly stated previously. That is the standard calculation, however.
Okay. And so what we're looking to do a TBR on is $1,083,000 less than what we were looking for a couple of days ago. And on page 5, I think it is, there's a list, on page 5, there's a table here, proposed capital and special projects 23-24, the annual debt service shows. But the total on that page is $8,098,224, not $8,499,460. So where's the other $401,000?
Just bear with us for a moment. So, I mean, the answer is, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Armstrong, that it's essentially just 2 different approaches to how the number is arrived at. The exact reference I don't have in front of me, but I would believe that the figure at the very top of the table, the $8,499,460 at the very top of the table should tie into the temporary borrowing resolution.
Okay. But it says total long-term debt in financing plans, and then it says total scheduled long-term debt, and those numbers don't match.
Right. I mean, in that case, you can see we're already excluding the Greenwood water utility, for example.
Okay.
So that's that would be the variance in terms of each line item within that table makes up.
Okay, so that leads me to my next question, is that you say that the Greenwood water utility is excluded from these figures, and yet it's still included in the list of projects that we will be including in the TBR, so
That's correct.
does that make sense? On one hand, you're saying it's excluded, and yet it's part of the TBR.
Correct. The TBR is necessary for us to access the financing for the water utility as well. The calculation that we use within the table, the numerator is the debt service obligation for the general rate and the sewer rate, and then the denominator is the own source revenue for the sewer and general rate, and it doesn't include the utility revenue. So it would be a mismatch to include the debt service for the utility within the calculation.
Because you're saying that the debt service is coming out of general funds as opposed to coming out of water rates?
the water rate would fund the debt service associated with the long-term debt for the utility. And then that is why both the revenue and the debt service for the utility are carved out of the calculation that ties back into the provincial FCI.
Okay.
Thank you. No other questions.
Great. So moving on to the changes that have impacted the operating reserve. And you can see on the slide there a reference to Appendix B, which provides a revised schedule of the operating reserve. And there are 4 key items that are impacting it in the revised budget. So the first one being the RCMP, King's Transit and Valley Waste, and then the revisions coming forward as part of the changes to the capital budget. So the first being the RCMP and our mandatory cost contribution to policing services. So on March 24th, 2023, we received a letter from the Department of Justice that detailed the municipality's share of the RCMP costs for the period, and that totaled out to a little over $9 million, which was roughly $261,000 below our preliminary estimate. The amount from the RCMP represented a 6% increase, while our estimates used closer to 9.1%. The reduced costs are proposed to be directed instead towards the operating reserve, maintained there for utilization against future potential increases in the mandatory costs of protective services. And in particular, an element behind that proposed decision is the fact that the collective agreement for the RCMP has expired as of the end of March 31st, 2023, so they're entering into a new round of bargaining. So there's a level of uncertainty associated with how that will impact future costs. And so since there was a budget savings in 23-24, we thought the prudent approach was to direct those funds into the operating reserve. King's Transit and Valley Waste each had a fairly similar situation take place. So both of those draft budgets, which were used to build out our operating budget, included enhanced capital contributions. For King's Transit, it was $162,000, and for Valley Waste, it was $369,600. Neither of those enhanced capital contributions were approved by the interim IMSA board. And rather than completely removing those amounts from the operating budget, the, once again, similar approach to what was being proposed with the RCMP, we would instead direct those or maintain those enhanced capital contributions within our operating reserve and be held there for future costs of capital associated with either of King's Transit or Valley Waste. A slight difference between the two situations with King's Transit, the enhanced capital contribution was to be funded from the general rate in 23-24, and so that amount is coming from the tax rate and would be directed to operating reserves, whereas the Valley Waste contribution was previously held in an operating reserve and was to be accessed for contribution in 23-24. However, now that that hasn't been approved, we would simply maintain that operating reserve for future use.
If I could just interrupt you, Councillor Windsor, I think had a question regarding the last slide.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and Mr. Chair, and through you to Mike. Those 4 items packaged together there, I was trying to figure out, so how do they impact the operating budget in total? So if we're leaving the RCMP and then King's Transit and Valley Waste, they have no impact? We're leaving, they're just being redirected to reserve instead of?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Windsor. Yes, there is no impact, with the exception being for Valley Waste, given its unique situation as being an existing reserve. We no longer need to budget for that reserve transfer, so that does factor into reduced overall total expenditures, but
So then we were able to reduce the expenditure budget by that amount because that was in their accounts?
that's correct.
So 369,900, 369,600, we were able to reduce our budget by. Is that my interpretation of that?
Correct.
Okay. And the capital budget, that had no impact on the operating budget whatsoever?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there was actually a slightly small, $30,000 opposite effect as a result of the changes to the capital budget, which was just about to detail. So that is related to the rain gauges and wind monitoring project. That upfront feasibility work is
Okay.
proposed to be financed from general operations and would have an effect of increasing.
So then if I interpret those two numbers together, they net to 339,600, which is the reduction in the operating budget,
Correct.
and that's the only reduction in the operating budget.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Killam.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm wondering if there was any indication of the impact of the retroactive obligations to the RCMP will have any indication of the number?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we have an in-house calculated figure that it's difficult to say how accurate it truly is, but Mr. Bard was commenting on the potential impact of the balance of the operating reserve and how the surplus could result in a minimum of the about 25% of total operating expenditures balance of that operating reserve. That minimum was factoring in our estimate of what the retro cost could be. So hopefully that answers your question sufficiently.
So we don't have a real number yet?
No.
No. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. No other questions presently?
Terrific. So the fourth impact was the impacts from the capital budget. So I've already discussed it slightly. The overall reduction in the capital budget for 23-24 was a reduction of $1,586,000, and that is all primarily related to debt finance projects. There is, as I mentioned, the $30,000 increase, which is slightly offsetting that decline, and it's related to the project 233401, the rain gauges and wind monitoring feasibility study. And as I mentioned, financed from the general operating reserve, or at least proposed to be. I guess I've already covered pretty well everything on that slide. So unless there are any questions on those changes.
Councillor Windsor, did you have something further?
Well, I will ask you a question. It's probably maybe as good a time as any to ask it. It's general in nature, which I think is a reasonable way to look at things. And it's challenging because everything is presented kind of in an omnibus way, so it's hard to dissect the questions. But in doing your review based on the comments that you heard last week, was there any attempt to look at, which was my big concern, look at the amount of the expenditure overall and the amount of the positions overall that were heading to the budget? Some $5,393,000.
Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Windsor. So our focus in our review was centered around the reserves and the long-term debt. The other recommendations that were put forward in the original budget were remained following our review. So we appreciated the comments that were outlined in terms of the growth of the budget. I mean, it certainly is reflective, I think, in detail in the budget books, both for last year and this year, in terms of the areas that needed that increased capacity and increase in expenditures. So there wasn't any further review done in that regard.
So in looking at reserves and long-term debt even, but I think you heard some significant concerns about the total increase in expenditures. There's other ways to come at the reserve and the debt, which includes looking at the expenditures. And that wasn't looked at?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Windsor, we considered it, but we still felt that our recommendations in terms of the operating budget needed to persist for further deliberations by Council.
Just of note, $5,393,520 is 10%. Over the next 10 years, the amount of burden, tax burden that we're adding to our citizens there is $53,050,000 uninflated.
Yeah, that's
And that's in a single
perhaps a
budget.
question for debate, Councillor, as opposed to clarification questions of
Yeah.
the individuals.
No, it's what I was getting to, Mayor, was the concerns that were raised in our meeting about the total increase in expenditures and the responsibility that we have to our citizens to have a kind of there's a lot of factors that should be considered in and balanced.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at, Councillor. Thank you. Any further questions of clarification on what's been presented? No other questions? Proceed.
So just a simple wrap up of some of the high level figures, and then I'll pass you back to Mr. Barr to walk through the recommendations themselves. So the revised operating budget is $59,447,750. That's a decrease of $339,600, and that's primarily related to the enhanced capital contribution for Valley Waste and the change to the rain gauges and wind monitoring project. The revised capital and project budget of $27,623,166 is a decrease of $1,586,000 and primarily relates to, once again, the rain gauges and wind monitoring project and the Meadowview Solar Garden project. The revised 5-year capital plan of $57,989,712. That's a decrease of $21,729,000 and is mostly related to, once again, the Meadowview Solar Garden project and another large component being the pedestrian infrastructure project, the sidewalk leading to Horton High School. And so with that, I can leave you to the recommendations.
So similar to our initial presentation, we've got the 6 remaining recommendations that we'd be prepared to walk through. I think there's probably some procedural.
Just before you proceed, I had 2 lights jump on just as Mr. Livingston was halfway to the other podium, so Deputy Mayor Lutz.
Thank you. No, I was just excited to move the motion, that's all.
Thank you. Councillor Windsor.
Yeah, thank you. I had a couple of questions in the document, particularly that was recently distributed. I'd like to, because we didn't take time until, we didn't take time with Mr. Barrett Hall to ask some questions. I had a couple of questions.
Certainly, this is the time for any questions for clarification of the document.
Thank you.
Yes.
And some of them has been answered. So I just want clarity that the only change to the operating budget was because there was reserve in Valley Waste that we felt we don't have to put more money in. Is that right?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Windsor, the only changes to the operating budget were really incidental to the changes that we made relative to long-term debt and the reserve budgets.
And yeah, I think maybe my questions have been generally answered. I made comments, and I'll just refer to it here again. In the 5-year capital plan, how it drops off, which I think is not a representation of our capital needs at all, not even looking to our new, what new infrastructure may be on the horizon, but we dropped from 27 to 4 million. I just think we have to look at our capital planning and make sure that we've got a capital plan that is more representative of the needs, just not based on the condition of the existing infrastructure, but that which we would foresee.
Is there a
That
question?
would be all.
Is
That
there a
would be-
question in there for the presenter? No?
Well, my concern, I guess, my question was last time was, in kind of inferring that we could have done better, but there's not a particular questionnaire today over and above that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Go ahead, Mr. Bear. You're on. Or you were, when you and I are fighting for it. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the recommendation we have in front of you gets into approvals of the capital budget and the operating budget. I believe there probably are some procedural issues in relation to the previous motions to table and defer. That probably should be addressed.
Yes, and
before we-
perhaps you can remind me. My recollection was slightly different from the recollection of the clerk, but I'm sure the clerk is correct. And as I recall, one motion was moved and tabled, but I think the clerk's indication to me was that 2 motions were moved and amended, and the rest of them were simply taken off the agenda to be considered. So, do we have, Madam Clerk, 2 motions to bring back to the table, or 1?
There's 2 motions.
All right. Do you have them there? All right. The first motion that was tabled was that on motion of Councillor Allen and Councillor Granger that Municipal Council approve the capital budget with gross expenditures of $28,689,166. So I'd like to begin with a motion to bring this back to the table for consideration. Could I have someone move that, Deputy Mayor, and a seconder, please? Seconded by Councillor Allen. The motion is back for consideration. It's apparent that we have a series of proposed motions to come before us that are substantially different in their terms than the motions that we tabled. If I look to Councillor Allen and Councillor Granger, could I ask, we have 2 choices, either defeat these motions or pass them, or withdraw them in favor of the other motions coming forward for discussion and debate. So let's try the second suggestion first. Could I look to Councillor Allen and Granger to agree to remove this motion? Yes, I have agreement from both councillors. So the motion has been removed from consideration, provided I have the agreement of the rest of council. If anybody objects, please say so. No objection. Could I have the second tabled motion, please? And that was and it was on motion of Councillor Granger, but seconded by Councillor Armstrong in this case, that the operating budget with gross expenditures of $59,817,350 be approved as presented on the March 29th, 2023 meeting. Again, I would look to the mover and seconder to see whether they're prepared to withdraw the motions. Councillor Granger indicates yes. Councillor Armstrong? You were the seconder. Are you prepared to? Oh, that was from the previous meeting, right? Yeah. Okay. Consent of council. Councillor Windsor?
Yeah, I was going to question the amount, but that's the amount that was there last time, so
Yes.
we'd have to change that.
Yes.
Thank you.
No objection from councillor. Then the motion has been removed from consideration, and we can proceed with the suggested recommendations. The first recommendation is that Municipal Council approve the 2023-24 capital and project budget with gross expenditures of $27,623,166. Do I have a mover of the motion? Deputy Mayor. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Killam. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor or otherwise, please vote now.
Yay.
Thank you, Councillor. It's like your voice comes from the clouds. And indeed, it does come from the cloud, doesn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, just waiting on the results. Well, we have one vote for. Perhaps we could try this again then, could we? I think perhaps something happened with the system, since there were no contrary votes. Okay, the voting is open. Would you please vote yea or nay on the motion now, please?
Yay for me.
Thank you. All right, Councillor Harding voting in favor. That makes it unanimously in favor. Thank you. Proceeding to the second recommendation, which is that Municipal Council approve the 5-year capital plan totaling $57,989,712 as summarized in Appendix C to the April 4th, 2023 request for decision. Do I have a mover of the motion? Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Allen. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor or otherwise, please vote now.
Yay for me.
Thank you. Thank you. The motion is passed with one negative vote. Could I have the next recommendation, please? It's been recommended that Municipal Council approve the request of a temporary borrowing resolution from the province of Nova Scotia in the amount of $8,499,460 attached as Appendix D to the April 4th, 2023 request for decision. Could I have a mover of the motion, please? Moved by the Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Allen. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor or otherwise, please vote now.
Yay for me.
Thank you. And that motion's passed unanimously. Thank you. And the next recommendation is that the 2023-2024 operating budget with gross expenditures of $59,447,750 be approved as summarized in Appendix E to the April 4th, 2023 request for decision. Could I have a mover of the motion, please? Moved by Councillor Granger, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Discussion on the motion. Councillor Windsor.
Thank you, Mayor. It is with regret that I have to say that I will not be voting in support of this motion, and I'd like to explain why it's one of the biggest votes that I make in a year, in a functional year. I am concerned with the increase in expenditures. I'm concerned with that, with what it's presenting as, in my view, a sustainable financial sustainability issue. The budget is increasing by $5,396,520, 10%. Our assessment lift was only $4,836,300. And so we're spending more than $557,220 more than the lift. In other words, we're spending $12,000. So we're digging into what we have, reserves or whatever, to do that. I'm disappointed that staff didn't look at the operations budget. There was more than the depth and the reserve. That's all fed or unfed by the operating budget, and no attempt was made. That is disappointing to me. In terms of budgeting over this council, this constitutes a 3-year increase, 3 budgets of $10,327,339, a 21% increase in 3 years over expenditures. And I'm so mindful when I talk about the numbers that this is an impact on our taxpayers, and we're seeing every day the dire straits that our taxpayers are in. So the increase, 3-year increase up to 10 plus million is 21%. And if you extrapolate that out over 10 years, not considering inflation, it's 103 million tax burden that we're putting on our taxpayers over the next 10 years. I want us to budget with full consideration for the inflationary impacts upon us, the opportunities that's before us, how we have to prepare ourselves to meet those. But it has to be balanced with some, I think, more fiscal discipline than we have put in this budget. In terms of positions, we're increasing by 12% in 1 year. That's after the increases of the 2 previous years. That's a 14% increase in PYs, and our salary dollars is going to go up by 1.3 million, or 16.6% increase in salaries. Over the 3 years of this council, the increase will be 22.45, or 30.3% increase in PYs. A $2.753 million increase in salary costs, or a 42.7% increase in 3 years of this council. I'm concerned that we're heading in a direction where the sustainability is significant. And I'm concerned that this is going to, after we're out of our seats, or some of us, this is going to really be a burden. And of the positions that we're asking for, 4 of them haven't even been allocated. We made an attempt to put some back into the taxpayer's pocket. Well, over the course of this budget, the total that we put back, we're attempting to put back is $124,800 out of just about a $5 million tax increase. I'm trying to be mindful, and I looked at the other elements of the budget, like the intermunicipal service agreements and the mandatory payments, and how much they contributed to our deficit. The biggest contribution was our own in-house stuff. Even our mandatory payments did not approach near that much. Funding for external parties, 3.5% over the previous year, or $7,450. Fire departments, 111,825, or 4.3. Some examples. So this really concerns me. I'm really concerned about the taxpayer out there, and I have no greater responsibility, stewardship responsibility, than the fiscal side of things. And I was looking in our document about our commitments to financial sustainability and fiscal management. I think what we're proposing is a drift, a significant drift away from that. And so I cannot support this budget today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Matart. I'll be very pleased to support the motion in front of us this afternoon. I think our budget grows because we grow. And as we grow, we need to expand and be able to provide the services that we're not only mandated to provide, but that we want to provide. And I think this budget is a reflection of the times, and that's what every good budget should be. We're able to maintain the tax rate, hopefully. We're not there yet, but that is one of the recommendations. We know that next year all of our mandatory payments will be increased due to uniform assessment having a 1-year lag. So recognizing that costs will be 1-year delay for them to reach our budget. So rather than concern, I feel excited about the vision, about the strategic priorities that we're getting some movement on, and the fact that we have done our best to support those who require support the most when they receive their tax bills, and that we have continued to do that year over year. So I will be voting in favor of the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Granger. No, it's all right. Councillor Granger, you need a moment? I'll come back to you. Did anyone else wish to speak on the motion? If not, briefly, I'll indicate my reasons for voting in favor of the motion. Some very similar to those of, I have some of the concerns that Councillor Windsor has expressed, but my reason for voting in favor of the motion, the reasons are very similar to some of those already expressed by the Deputy Mayor. But in terms of mandatory contributions, we've got we're faced with a great number of those. We've got over which we have absolutely no control. We just get a bill and we pay the bill. We not only have the back pay of the RCMP, for example, but we have an annual increase that's almost $1 million. We have a $1 million increase in our contributions regarding education. We have all of the IMSA costs that are creeping up on us, and as the Deputy Mayor has indicated, when all of our contributions to these matters are based upon uniform assessment, then that that puts us in the position of anticipating significant increases in those costs. In addition, of course, we have inflation. We have costs of construction and supply issues that have put those types of costs in a stratosphere that we hadn't anticipated at any point in time. And hopefully many of those things will correct themselves over the next 4 years, but certainly over the next 2 years, we can anticipate that we're going to be facing these types of fiscal challenges. The pressure for additional services, for improvement of our existing in-ground services, for improvement of our wastewater systems, for improvement and additions to staff in order to be able to handle the volume of planning applications that come to us and inspections that need to be done. We do need increased staff, and we're competing all the time now for qualified people to fill those positions, and many of them don't get filled for a year or more simply because of the competition that's out there and the scarcity of qualified persons. We have the luxury of not having increased our rate. Not to say, Councillor Windsor, that taxes payable by our citizens haven't increased because of the increased value of their real estate holdings, but our rate of tax is applicable to those real values held by our citizens in terms of property assets are and have been held for almost a dozen years. And I, like the Deputy Mayor, will be looking at a future recommended resolution here that holds those rates where they have been for that period of time. So those are the reasons for which I will be voting in favor of the motion. Councillor Granger, are you able to speak now, or do you?
I got so excited there, I got all choked up. I think everything that I needed to say has been said. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other debate on the motion? Any other debate? Seeing none, all those in favor or otherwise of the motion, please vote now.
Yay for me.
Thank you, Councillor. The motion passes with one negative vote. Recommendation 5. Did you wish to speak to that, Mr. Barr, or just have me go through it? The recommendation number 5 is that the residential and resource property tax rate for 2023-24 be set at 0.853 per $100 of assessment. Do I have a mover of the motion? Councillor Allen, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Discussion on the motion, please. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor or otherwise, please vote now.
Yay for me.
Thank you, Councillor. The motion's passed unanimously. Thank you. And the 6th recommendation is that the commercial property tax rate for 2023-24 be set at $2 and, well, let me put it in the actual numbers, $2.287 per $100 of assessment. Someone would like to move that motion? Councillor Armstrong, seconded by Councillor Granger. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor or otherwise, please vote now.
Yay for me.
Thank you. The motion's passed unanimously. Thank you. Anything further, Mr. Barr? No? Thank you very much. Mr. Livingston, thank you very much for your presentation as well. Is there any other business to come before the meeting? Any other business? Councillor Windsor.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to get an update on the Valley Waste and King's Transit, particularly as it is functioning under the new structure. I don't think we've had any reports since the two individual committees were disbanded. So I don't know what can be done today, Mayor, but it would be good to have some kind of an update, particularly on how that structure is working and how the individual units are doing.
I'll see that something's put together for you for the next meeting, Councillor. Thanks for raising it. Anything else to come before the business? Become before the meeting? Councillor Armstrong.
It's not really business, it's more of a comment, if you
Okay,
allow
sure.
me. We've been muddling through this budget process now since the 15th of May, or March. Oh, God, not May. And I just wanted to say, I don't envy our staff their job, and I don't want their job. But I want to thank them for all they've done and the questions that they've answered for us. And the only thing that I would like to see possibly next year is if we could start a little earlier and maybe get a little more time with it. I felt this was rushed, and in some ways I think our questions weren't necessarily answered to our satisfaction. But I do thank them. Like I say, I don't want your job. I don't envy you your job, but thank you very much. I certainly appreciate everything you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. There is some suggestion on our books that the financial information comes to us earlier by way of amalgamating budget and finance with another and recreating another body that is so that all councillors get the financial information at the same time, and it gives us more time as a council to deal with it. So I don't disagree with your comments. Any other business to come before the meeting? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Allen, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Any discussion? No, you don't get any discussion on a motion to adjourn. All those in favor or otherwise, please vote now.
Yay for me.
Thank you, Councillor. Thanks for attending.
Very welcome. I'll see you at 6 or 6:30, whichever one.
6 o'clock, sir, if you can make it.
It's okay. 6
right.
o'clock.
Yes.
I shall be there.
The motion's passed. We are adjourned. Thank you.